I'd like to thank you for participating in Space Walk of Fame's Oral History Project. And before we begin, if you would please state your name and any other nicknames or anything that you might be known by as well.
My name is Shirley Wildermuth. No nicknames, I'm just Shirley.
Just Shirley?
Just Shirley.
Oh. I wonder, probably the best place for us to start is what brought you, how you came to Brevard County.
My husband and I were living in San Diego, and we were involved in the old General Dynamics program at that time. It's been now called Convair, and it was the old Atlas program. And there was a fellow by the name of Higginbotham that came through. He was on a recruiting trip. And my husband had set up or helped to set up what they called a clean room out in San Diego. And Mr. Higginbotham was very interested in this. He hired Wayne, and so the whole family moved to Titusville. And this was in late '65. In fact, we arrived in Titusville on New Year's Day of '66. That was our new year.
When you arrived here in Brevard County in Titusville, what did you think of the area?
Oh, this is what you call a cultural shock. Moving from San Diego to Titusville, I understand that Boeing Company paid their employees swamp pay, and I can understand that. There were a couple stores in Titusville. The old, what they call the Big Apple Shopping Center, had a Belk Lindsay's, and there were a couple grocery stores. We moved to an area which at that time was not a part of Titusville. It was the old Indian River City, which was additional community south of Titusville. And that's where we originally lived for about 2 years. And then we moved down to an area which was a street called Barna. And Barna was only about 3 blocks long. Now it goes all the way through and clear up to, I think, 405. But at that time, Barna was only about 3 blocks long. And while we were living there, they opened the streets up both ways, and we wound up to be on a major intersection. So the cars that came through kept taking our mailbox off, and so we moved to south of Titusville, where we're on a little cul-de-sac, so no more mailboxes in the street. But this was a little later, about '68.
Now, how'd you find the people, the locals? You being somebody from California.
Well, 90% of the people that we associated with were new to the area also. There were a lot of people from Alabama, and all of our friends were from out of town. There were very few locals that were involved in the same work. So the out-of-towners sort of clung together because none of us knew anybody else. And we formed our own little groups, and we went out to dinner all the time and found things to do. The guys went fishing, and it was just, there was a difference between the space people and the local people. And there were very few of the local people because the whole town had been inundated with out-of-towners, the space people that had moved in.
When you went out to dinner in places like that, did you stay in the Titusville area, or did you go down more towards Cocoa Beach?
There were 2 or 3 bars in town, but very few places to eat. We went to Cocoa Beach to eat, or up to New Smyrna to the airport or someplace, but there were very few places in Titusville. Titusville was very small. Of course, this was back in '66, and of course it hadn't started to grow. Most of the growth for the space program was down in the Cocoa Beach area because there wasn't a causeway that took the people over to the space program. When they opened the causeway, then that opened Titusville to the space people, the workers.
When you went to Cocoa Beach, did you go to like Ramones?
Oh, absolutely. You know, that you have to go to Ramones and to,
Mousetrap?
Mousetrap, that's what I was trying to think of, thank you. Yeah, everybody went there, and there were 2 or 3 other places that we went to that were pretty lively. We were pretty much party people because we were all, we worked hard during the week and took time off to enjoy ourselves.
Did you attend launch parties and things of that nature?
Oh, absolutely. We worked for Bendix at the time. My husband, of course, started there, and I got a job with Bendix in May, I think, of '66, and so we were very much involved in the Bendix parties. Every time there was a launch, Bendix had a launch party, and they were pretty wild affairs. Pretty wild, but
could you elaborate a little more on
pretty much a drinking crowd. There was a lot of liquor consumed, and a lot of people that had a little problem getting home. They had quite a few of them in Titusville at the country club. I think the country club was open about that time, maybe about in 69, 70, something like that. So there were quite a few of the parties there, and of course Bendix was headquartered in Titusville, so most of the Bendix parties were there. And
did they have
well
elaborate
attended.
food spreads?
Yes, yes. Big buffet tables, and I think that they were the places that we had. The one I remember particularly was at the Royal Oak Country Club, and the drinks were poured by the bottle, so of course there were a lot of the bottles consumed, and a lot of the food that was eaten, and people were in a good mood, of course, because this was, we had gotten the launch off, and of course at that time, why the astronauts and the workers were all a part of one big family. It was a very close-knit group. I remember when the fire was, and I wasn't at work at that time. I was down at the grocery store, and when the word came out that there had been a fire, it was crushing. It was like a part of your family had gone. Very close-knit group, and everyone felt that.
Did you have relatively frequent contact with some of the astronauts?
Not really, no. I was with the ground support, and the closest we ever came, I worked in a building called the MSO building, which was the Manned Spacecraft Operation Facility, and they had a big auditorium room and offices on one side, and in this large area there was what was called a altitude chamber, where the spacecraft itself was put into the chamber and the air was pumped out of it, which gave the feeling of weightlessness. The astronauts would go in and get into the altitude chamber, and then when they pumped it down, why they would get out. But there wasn't any close-knit group. I knew a lot of people that knew the astronauts, but I did not.
I remember a few minutes ago we were talking a little bit about Gus Grissom specifically.
Yes. People have a tendency to feel that the astronauts are bigger than life, but most of them are pretty small-statured people. And Gus was short and stocky, and of course when you get into your space suit, you have some thermal underwear on, and then you go into an area where they attach all of the instrumentations on it. Then when you come out, you get out of that and you're left with your long johns. And he come charging out of the altitude chamber area and was stomping down the hallway, yelling at the top of his lungs about the spacecraft was a piece of junk. And he got everybody's attention, because I don't care what size he is, he was one of the astronauts, and people paid attention. But fascinating people. You have to admire somebody that will take on this entirely new thing that nobody had ever done before and go to the moon. Some people don't even think we've been there yet. But yeah, they were very interesting people, and Gus made his presence known to everybody in the area.
And after the fire, you have this slowdown period while they're trying to find out.
Yes.
What was it like here during this period in which they're trying to find out what's going on with what happened with the fire?
A morning time that you have lost your family. I was working down what they call the industrial area at the time, and they took one of the buildings and took the whole space craft in pieces and put it back together to rebuild it up into what they call a fluid test area, which is part of the industrial area, and put it back together again to try to find out what had caused it so that it would never happen again. And this was a somber, hard-working time. There wasn't too much joviality about the whole thing, because it was a distinct sorrow. It's if you've ever lost any of your close family members, this is what it was. It was just crushing.
Was there a sense that the space program, Apollo, might end, or was there always the feeling that this was just a hurdle and that it would go on?
To a certain extent, there's always people, the naysayers, but there are many more people who are, we have a problem and we'll fix it. And I think that was more prevalent with the people that were actually doing the work. The people who wanted to call a halt to it mainly were people who didn't believe in it to begin with. And there was probably a reason that they could call it quits. If we ever have another large major catastrophe besides the ones that we've already have, you'll find that there are always people who say, is it worth it, and should we be doing this? I think that the space program is something that we will do the same way that the railroads were done, and the time that they had cross-country railroad systems, or the first airplanes, or anything which was experimental at the time. There will be a space program, and we will go to other planets.
I wonder if we could backtrack just
Sure.
a little bit. What prompted you to go out and get a job when you arrived here?
I was going to stay home and be a regular mom. You know, take the kids to school, fix the dinner, and do the washing and the ironing. And I kept going around trying to find something that I was working on, such as some to tile that I wanted to do, or some artistic materials that I wanted. There was no place in Titusville to get anything like that. There were a couple department stores that you could buy clothes, but nothing else. Finally, in frustration, I said, I got to get out of here. So I went down and applied for a couple jobs. One of them was at local auto dealership that they needed somebody in the office, and I had done insurance work before, and he thought that that would fit in very well. But then at the same time, I went over and applied to the space program, and a fellow by the name of Frank Grabinick hired me as what they call a component specialist. I was working in the logistics area, issuing parts.
For Bendix?
For Bendix, yes.
Your husband was working for Bendix as well?
Yes.
Was that a problem that the two of you were working for?
No. In fact, most people did. If a husband worked for a company, usually a wife worked there also. But if you consider the proximity of the Space Center, my husband worked out in the North End in a clean lab. Clean lab is where they would take the parts and clean them to microclean and measure the particles that came off. It's like the new systems that you'll find in your air cleaner. And that's where he originally started working, and it was on the North End, out here by north even of the VAB.
So if they'd be up like by Wilson's Corners?
That's exactly where he worked, was at Wilson's Corner. And I worked in the South End, in the industrial area. Our management was entirely different. He worked in work area 5, I think it was, and I worked in work area 3.
So you didn't carpool then?
No. In fact, we were normally on different shifts. And I worked daytime, and we'd communicate by writing nasty notes. No. We'd write notes to each other.
Where you're working, is it predominantly female or?
No, predominantly male. The logistics area at that time, you must remember that at that time there was nothing that said that a female women's lib had not come into being. And it was strictly a male-dominated area. I was a little bit unusual, and they didn't know what to do with me. One of my bosses told me at one time, you can't get a raise because you're a female and you can't issue parts. And I said, what do you think I'm doing on third shift? But that was a sign of the times. It wasn't anything unusual. But this did get my attention, and I started in subtle little ways demanding my rights as an employee rather than a female.
Was it a difficult working environment for you being the only female? Or?
No, not really. In fact, there were other females there in different areas, and they were normally secretaries or parts like that. I was unusual because I was called a component specialist, which was the same category as the men were that worked in the tool crib, and of course I did too.
Why do you think that it seems so unusual for females working in the tool crib? How did it come about that you were hired? I mean, what do you think led to him picking a
I don't really know. I have thought about that, and why they gave me that category, I don't know, unless of course they needed somebody and that category was open, and they figured that I would do secretarial work with a category such as component specialist. I don't really know. I never asked at the time. The only time that it ever came up when other people were getting raises and I wasn't. And because I was a female, and I started complaining about it, and too much longer after that there were 2 or 3 occasions that lawsuits were brought, and one female engineer won a case against the company. The whole situation. About the time I started moving around a little bit, and I moved into the warehouse. Now this was when later, when I was, Bendix had lost the contract, and I was with BSI, Boeing Services International, which was an arm of the Boeing company. And I got a job as in the warehouse, and through women's lib, or whatever you want to call it, I was a warehouseman. There was another lady by the name of Josiel Travis, and I were the 2 first lady warehousemen on the Cape. And we did everything. We swept the floor, we stocked the shelves, we delivered parts, we delivered material, furniture, anything that had to be done, we drove. We did. We drove a truck, everything. One time they were having secretary's day, and they offered me a plant, a flower. This is after we were cleaning the warehouse, and that didn't go over very well. But a number of things happened which you had to fight all the way along, because you were a woman doing a man's job, demanding the same salary that the men were getting, so we had to do the same amount of work.
And did you feel at any time that the company attempted to make it more difficult for you to do a man's job, that they would write certain things into the job description to make it difficult for you to accomplish the same thing as a man was doing?
Besides trying to give us a secretary's plant, no. One time when they were having layoffs, when BSI had lost the contract, one of the bosses told me that he felt that it would be best if he laid the people off which didn't have a family to support. And I asked him if that was the way they hired their people, and I was not laid off. But it wasn't so much the company or the people involved, it was a sign of the times. And the female population, and they're still fighting the battle. Their pay is still not comparable. Most female salaries are not comparable to the male salaries doing the same job. But hopefully I had some positive input to this whole situation. Behind the MSO building in the industrial area.
Ms. Travis being African American, was there ever about her being black back then?
Well, there were a number of, not so much with Josiel, but there were a good many of the black males that were either denied jobs or denied promotions. And then came the time when companies had to show improvement in their hiring practices and their practices of giving promotions, both to females and to blacks. And of course, I teased Josiel about being a double dipper because she was a black female. So, but there were a good many times, and there was one time that during the old Bendix days that they had to go out and hire minority people, mostly blacks, and they used to say that if you were black, you could get a job doing anything. Some of them there I remember one fellow, his qualifications was that he had been a bread handler in a bakery. So, you know, I mean, they had to hire minorities, and there weren't really that many to draw from. You would think that there would be, being in Titusville in a southern town, but there weren't.
In relation to movements from company to company, loses a contract, and the employees are subsequently laid off, and another contract company is replacing them with a new contract. I wonder if you could elaborate on that experience.
The hardest time, when they were showing upward mobility for female employees, I was hired as into procurement department out of the warehouse.
Is it still for BSI?
No, wait a minute. This had to be with Bendix. My time frame probably is a little off, but Bendix lost the contract, and I was with the procurement department, and Boeing had bid the contract with no procurement. So that meant that none of the procurement people had jobs. And there was no way of getting a job and moving from company to company. So we were all without jobs. And we worked there on the closeout team until such time as NASA and BSI realized they had to have procurement people. They had to have somebody to buy their parts and their materials, their supplies. So there was a change to the contract, which gave them procurement people, and then we got jobs. But it's a rough time. A lot of the people were considering leaving the area or anything because they had to have jobs.
When you were hired by BSI, did you have to take a pay cut?
No, I didn't, but there were a lot of people that did. Now, this was the worst time was when Bendix lost the contract, and part of it went to TWA. And TWA had bid the contract with lower wages. And this created all kinds of problems that the people that were doing the same job, and they had to come back to work the next Monday for a different company at half the salary. The congressman and Congress itself put through an act called the Service Contract Act, and this meant that any government contractor or anybody doing work for the government must pay their people a certain amount of money. So that meant that that wouldn't happen again. BSI, when they bid the contract, they bid it with no benefits, and by benefits I mean vacation, sick leave, retirement, anything like that. So they had to pay their employees cash in lieu of so much an hour, and I don't remember exactly how much it was. I think it was probably something like 20 cents an hour in addition to make up for the benefits. So at the end of the time, when BSI was no longer there, then we had no accumulated or accrued sick leave, vacation time, retirement, but we had the 20 cents an hour that we had had over the period of years.
And so in theory, that 20 cents an hour it was your responsibility then to invest that for retirement benefits and things of that nature.
If you chose.
Now, did they provide you with any kind of health insurance or anything?
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. Wow. Wow. But Bendix provided the full board.
Yes.
Now, when Bendix loses the contract and it becomes BSI.
Well, my time frame is a little off. When Bendix lost the contract, most of it was taken over by TWA, and then BSI came in later.
Okay. So for a while there, then you worked for TWA?
No, I worked for Bendix, and then I was on the closeout team, and then I went to BSI.
Okay. Now, when you leave Bendix, were you vested in your retirement?
With Bendix?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I worked for Bendix for probably about 12 years, and I do receive a Bendix retirement.
Okay. How do you get associated with EG&G? Well, first, what is EG&G?
Okay.
And then how do you get associated with it?
EG&G won the contract through their good efforts with the government. They were very well respected. The initials EG&G stand for 3 MIT professors whose names were Edgerton, Germeshausen, and Greer. And these 3 professors were instrumental in the Old Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb projects, building, designing, and testing, and the government was very impressed with the things that they had done. So the 3 professors formed a company. It grew. They hired a fellow by the name of O'Keefe. No, sorry. Sorry, my mind went blank.
We can throw it in there.
Yes. Okay. But they grew. They were very well respected in their work that they did. They had a contract with base support in Idaho called EG&G Idaho, and most of the management that came to work in Florida and started the EG&G Florida were from Idaho. A couple of them were from Rico, which was an EG&G contract in Las Vegas. And this is where the management people came from. A good company. Yes. Yes, they do.
When you work for the company, what is your, when do you start with them? Approximately what year? And what is your job title or function when you work with them?
It was in the early 70s that I was hired. I had gone through procurement with BSI and had progressed from a buyer to subcontract administrator to procurement chief. And I was hired by EG&G as procurement chief, which meant that I was in charge. And I had to hire something like 12, 15 buyers. This was a big job, probably more than I should have taken on because my background was really not that great. I knew procurement, but not, I hadn't really had that much management experience. And it was a very particular big job. I held that for 2 or 3 years and was replaced and went on to what was called a small business administrator. This was a job that I thoroughly loved. I was helping small businesses and minority businesses get started, do business with NASA, with their contractors, We had a statewide and a national organization that I think I'd found my niche.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was a good thing to be. I could see some of the things that I was doing was actually helping the small business community.
And this would have been in the 1980s?
Yes.
Okay.
Hmm. And I retired in 1990.
1990.
Hmm.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about some of your reflections on specific space missions and stuff, and Apollo in general. For you, what is Project Apollo for you on a personal level?
I think this was the first big program that I was involved in. The Mercury was pretty much over when we arrived in Titusville. The Gemini was going on, but it didn't last that long. The Apollo was the big program. This is the thing that so many people were interested in when doing the work on, and from then on it went into the Space Lab and some of the other ones, but this is the first big program that you could see what was happening going to the moon, and things that were unheard of. It was something that you could dream about and envision, that you didn't think would ever happen, and here it was happening and you were involved in it. It was overwhelming, just absolutely thrilling every day to come to work and know that that's what you were doing, was involved in the space program.
Was Project Apollo so big that you felt almost anonymous because of its size, or did you always?
I don't think that was the feeling. The feeling was that everybody that was out there was, what were there, 20,000 people out there? I don't really know, but there were many, many people. But we were all out there with one objective in mind. And to be a part of this, we were all a part of the same group, and it was like a very large extended family. You never felt that you were being crushed in the enormity of it. Mm-hmm. It was all a part of you and your life, and this is what you did.
Apollo 8, first time we go around the moon, December of '68.
Okay.
What was your feelings when you see for the first time, Earthrise, and you see transmitted back?
You see these goosebumps. Yeah. It still gives me goosebumps to know that we've actually done this, that we, and nobody ever felt that they did it, or it was only the astronauts. It was all of us. We have done this. Between the landing on the moon and and then there was Apollo 13, and Houston, we have a problem. Things like this are all a part of your family. Everyone in their immediate family has problems that you work your way through. Well, this was just a large, large family that you just did everything possible that you could do, and you supported it all the way through, constantly, all the time. You lived, breathed, and talked space.
First time you see a Saturn V rocket?
I worked on the old Atlas program in San Diego, so this was not unusual. This was This was the beginning of it. I know I worked for the program when the Russians first made their first journey into space, and
Sputnik or Yuri Gagarin?
Sputnik.
Sputnik?
Yeah. This was back in
57.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was your feelings about Sputnik?
Oh, good grief. Where are we? Why are we just sitting here? Do something. Hurry up. Yeah, and then the Atlas was such a superb program. I worked in the parts department there out in San Diego, and we had bases all over with the old Atlas program. And it was a good program, but I don't think that we felt the excitement and the closeness that we did in working here on the center. That's when it all got to be very personal.
Yeah, Saturn V, you compare the size of a Saturn V to an Atlas.
Yeah, it's like a kiddie car with a Cadillac, you know. Yeah, I was never that close to the Saturn V. We had the Atlas program, but I always felt a certain amount of relationship to the General Dynamics program, as they were then. They've become Convair, and I guess they still are, but they were General Dynamics when I worked there. And when I worked for BSI, and Boeing had a contract over on the Cape side, and I knew a lot of the people and would go over and support their programs occasionally in the procurement department. So I know a little about it, but very little.
Your first time you see one of these launches, can you reflect on your first launch?
Oh, when we were working, we were, they later closed the roof of this building off that the MSO building. We used to go up on the roof, and they, much later, they started locking the doors because they were afraid that we'd fall off or something, but we'd go out there, and it was a straight shot looking down into the pad. And the launch was absolutely superb. Tears and goosebumps and choked throat, and then the rumble of the noise and the vibrations, and it's something that you've got to experience it to really know how tremendous this is, and then know that there are people sitting in that thing right above that huge firecracker. It's amazing.
I want to break here just for a second because it's time to flip that tape over.
Okay.
I'll stop here just for a moment. About 17 or 18 minutes of tape.
Okay.
Now, when we start up, I'd like to just confirm a few dates with you.
Okay.
You worked with Bendix from May of '66 to about 1977.
Yes.
And then from Bendix, you go to Boeing, BSI.
Yes.
And you worked there till 83, approximately 83, 84?
Yes, it was shortly before they lost the contract.
Okay. And then from there, you go from 83, 84 to your retirement in 1990 with EG&G?
Yes.
All right. Okay. That way we can assign time references to when we were talking earlier. I'd like to step back a little bit into the community, if we could, for these last moments. When you arrive here in '66, this is still the South.
Very much so.
What did you notice in the community in relation to minorities?
I had spent most of my high school years in Illinois, and I remember at the time that some of the big bands that would come around, and remember Charlie Barnett, who was the black fellow with Tommy Dorsey, and he couldn't stay in any of the hotels. This was the only time that I had ever run into any discrimination. I don't remember any in California. When we moved here, and to know that there were segregated schools, and I knew this in the back of my mind, but it was never really up front or something that I had really had a personal involvement with until one time my husband came home, and he was working third shift, and a lot of the guys would stop by the bar, and which opened any time the space workers were coming and going. And they all went in and had a beer, and there was this black engineer who must have been from someplace else, because everybody was from someplace else. And they all ordered a beer, and he picked his glass up, and the bartender took it away from him, threw the glass against the back wall, shattering it, and told him to go into the back room. That he used some explicit words, but the black people were not allowed in where the rest of them were drinking. When Wayne came home and was telling me this, it was hard to believe that in this day and age, in 1966, that people treated other people that way. It was unheard of. But this was the South. There were still incidences that you heard about people having their cars shattered. Even when I was involved with the Minority Business Council and was doing a lot of traveling with mostly black men, being on the council and minority councils, there were times that it was pointed out in sort of unusual ways that this was still the South, and it wasn't generally accepted that a white female was traveling with a black man.
And how long, and what time frame would that be?
This would have been in the late 80s. So see, things, although they've gotten better, they're still there.
When you arrive in '66, there's nothing outward though. There's no like colored only signs or anything here, right?
Schools were still segregated, I believe.
But like you didn't see signs that would say like a colored only drinking fountain or anything?
There
like
probably was. I remember talking to Josele Travis about her experiences in traveling, and one time having a flat tire and having to go to the restroom, and they weren't allowed to do so because the only ones they had were for whites. Things like this didn't happen to me personally, so I don't. I guess probably that we have an attitude, if you don't see it, you ignore it. And that isn't right, but that's normally the way it was. And in Titusville, there was the old Gibson School, which was a black segregated school. So I'm sure that there was still segregation at that time.
With Ms. Travis, with her working out at the Space Center, was she somebody that other African American workers looked to as a leader?
Oh, she would be a leader no matter where she was and what she was doing. She was very well educated. She had a terrific background. She had been in Titusville probably all of her life. I don't know if she was born here or not, but her family moved here right after the Civil War. her ancestry were house slaves in Augusta, I believe, in Georgia. So she was a leader in the community, especially the black community. Was one of these people that everybody turned to. They knew they could depend on her and her opinions and her influence.
I'd like to ask you a question about union activity. Were you at any time ever unionized?
I was never a member of the union. When I was working in the warehouse, there was a union there, yes, and it was covered by the union contract. I was never particularly involved in the union. My husband was in the union, and right shortly after we came, there was a long strike of 111 days, something like that, and my time frame is off again because I was working in procurement with Bendix at the time, I think, when the people went on strike. And I'm not sure of this time frame either, but he was out picketing some of the local places, and I was awarding contracts to do the work that he should have been doing. But we laughed about it. But I was in subcontracts, and he was in the union.
That brings me to that slowdown period we had here in the early 70s when Apollo, the last...
We went to the moon and got back, so now what, guys?
What was it like here in Brevard County?
There were 900 vacant houses in Titusville, and there really weren't that many houses. Titusville had not kept up with the boom, with the growth. So 900 vacant houses was devastating. It was almost like a ghost town. They had a little paper that was put out, and they probably still do, the KSC News or the Bulletin or whatever you call it. And you could pick it up, and you could, all the houses that were for sale. I remember calling one house that was down by BCC in Cocoa and asking the guy how much he wanted for his house, and he said, "You come over tonight and I will sign it over to you because I'm going to be gone in the morning." So this was a common occurrence. You could pick up any house, any place for nothing down and just start making the payments. But most people were afraid to do this because you didn't know how long your job would last. The people who had that did probably made money when the space program came back, but after we got to the moon and returned, there was nothing else there, and it was like a ghost town all over.
Businesses closing up?
Yes. All kinds of things, just there wasn't any place to go. As much as Kennedy got the people charged up about going to the moon, there was never anything that said, when we do that, we'll do this. So there was no program afterwards. And it was devastating because there wasn't any place to go. It was like you're wandering around lost.
And your husband was laid off?
Yes, but then he got a job back again. But when he was laid off, he was calling around to different places looking for work, and the normal reaction was, if you're a space worker, we don't want you. And I can understand that too, because knowing that the wages that they could afford to pay, and as soon as the space program opened back up again, you would go back where you could make a living wage, or the money that you had normally, that you'd been used to.
But you were you were fortunate throughout this time yourself, weren't you?
I was never laid off, never lost any work, or never lost any time. From the day I started until the day I retired, I was never out of work. And I was most fortunate in that. But you must remember, I was a female, and they were afraid of female. No.
We've only got just a couple of minutes left. Is there anything that I haven't touched on, or that we haven't addressed in any fashion that you feel that would be of interest to somebody in 100 years or so?
The things that have happened at the space program and the progress that we have made, I wish at some time we could have another program like they had occasionally, where they would show off all of the benefits of the program. Anything from pacemakers, ballpoint pens, microwave ovens, exotic materials, biochemistry. Most of these things have come out of the space program, but they've become so commonly accepted that you forget that our taxes paid for them originally. So they belong to all of us. I remember the first time that we had a ballpoint pen. You can remember the pens that you loaded up with the ink, and you don't remember that. You've heard your mother talking about it. But before the ballpoint pens, this is what used to happen. And it was the space program that had all of these things. And look at your pacemakers. How many people are living today with a pacemaker? These things came from the space program. I wish that every 2 or 3 years we could have a program like that with all of these technical advantages and the things that we have learned that we forget where it came from. And hopefully it'll continue on for another 100 years, and we'll be going to Mars and Pluto, and we'll have just as many new technologies that people aren't even dreaming of now.
I'd like to thank you for participating.
Thank you for having me, Laura.